Today we're talking to Professor Anya Ahmed about the big issues surrounding her subject at the moment and how her research aims to tackle those challenges. So Anya, to kick things off, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your research interests?
Okay, so I have a social science background, social policy and sociology. The research that I've kind of been doing for the last 20 years centres on marginalised communities, mainly Black and minority ethnic communities. I've sort of evolved into gerontological research, which is research on older and about older people. But I have to confess that I didn't start off with that ambition. It kind of happened over time as the communities that I was researching have aged. People tended to come over after the Second World War, so they're obviously getting older now. So we're looking at the issues that are affecting them. And obviously people will have read in the news that people from Black and Asian minority ethnic communities are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So my current focus on securing research funding is aimed at addressing some of those issues, because it looks like it's a combination of social deprivation, possibly demographics, the kind of spatial locality where people find themselves living in, the kind of housing they find themselves living in. So that, I think, is a really pressing issue for us to address at the moment.
So what motivates your research? How did you get into this field, and has there been any sort of personal experiences, anything that have led you to do this kind of study?
Yes, so sort of twofold really. Before I was an academic, I worked in social housing. So I was like a housing officer, but I've always been concerned and interested in social inequalities, and I've always been interested in issues around race and ethnicity and gender as well. Unsurprisingly, because my embodied reality, if you like, is I'm a mixed race woman, grew up in a working class background. So I've always been kind of personally interested in those things from an experiential point of view. But as I moved into academia, my original focus was looking at communities and where people kind of lived, what their kind of housing experiences are. And then that evolved into migration. But not just migration to the UK, migration by British people out of the UK, and what does it mean to be a migrant and an immigrant, and is it different if you're white and if you're not? And I think quite often it is. So that really fascinates me. It also kind of triggered an interest in the idea of community and what people feel that they belong to. So do people feel that they belong to places? Do they feel a sense of belonging to social networks? And also, how do people see themselves in relation to other people in terms of their identity? And how do those factors all work together? So I think they kind of mutually reinforce one another, this idea of place, networks and identity. And I find this fascinating because what people think they belong to tells us a lot about the world that they live in, or how they experience the world. And that really underpins a lot of the research that I do. And I'm very interested in storytelling and how people kind of tell their story. And I think, that's something that, again, I've done a lot of work on and would like to do more.
You've done a lot of studies on homelessness,
yes,
well, particularly over the last couple of years. Can you tell us a little bit more around that area of interest?
Sure. So that kind of goes back to my early roots, if you like. So I started off as a housing practitioner. I've had a very long interest in social housing. It also links to the notion of place that I've just talked about before, in neighbourhoods. Very much where people start their lives has an impact on their kind of life trajectory, if you like, in terms of their health outcomes, their educational outcomes, etc. And obviously, if people don't have a home, then their life chances are disrupted, affected very negatively, etc. So a lot of the work I've done over the last few years has focused on homelessness and housing need. The most recent project, I suppose, which is the most relevant to our conversation here, I led a team that looked at the implementation and operation of the Housing Act Wales, which was a internationally significant piece of legislation because it was the first in the world which has prevention at its core. So arguably, if you try to solve someone's homelessness once they become homeless, quite a degree of damage has already been done. The best thing to do is to stop it from happening in the first place. But this has not really been a policy imperative until pretty recently. So Wales were the first to introduce this, and our team did a sort of a 2-year study where we tracked about 150 people and looked at what their experiences of this legislation have been, whether their homelessness was prevented, what kind of problems that avoided happening. And we engaged with a lot of all of the local authorities in Wales as well to look at how they were implementing this legislation. And I think the reason why this legislation is so important is because it actually underpins the English Homelessness Reduction Act, which also focuses on prevention, and prevention is very much on the kind of international agenda at the moment.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you were tracking some of the experiences. What were the kind of things that were coming out of that study from the people that you spoke to?
Well, I think one of the big problems for homelessness providers and housing providers and homelessness preventers is that very often people present with a range of different, people are complicated, we're not one-dimensional. So what seemed to be happening is that a very large number of people who fall through the net, and quite often these people experience mental health issues. They might be experiencing substance and alcohol misuse issues as well. And when you put those things together, it actually creates significant challenges for service providers because they're calibrated to deal with one thing. So if you've got a mental health problem and a drug problem, then the mental health service might not really be able to cope with you. And similarly, if you've got a substance misuse issue and have mental health problems, drug services again may not be equipped to fully address your needs. So one of the main recommendations that we made as a result of the project was that there needs to be much better cross-disciplinary working between those kinds of services, so support services, mental health services, and drug and alcohol services. It's because people's issues are kind of multifaceted. So they were the people that fared the worst actually through this process, not least because it's a complicated process to navigate. The emphasis is very much on individuals to have agency and to, have kind of self-responsibility. And often, vulnerable people don't have that capacity. So that was another thing that we very strongly recommended, that, prevention's great, but people need to be supported to prevent their homelessness rather than have the onus on them to do it.
Did those recommendations lead to policy changes in Wales?
Some of them did. We made a whole host of recommendations because, one of the biggest findings was that although, as I said earlier on in our conversation, that, I'm a big fan of prevention. I think it really is the way forward. There are a number of challenges which actually prevent prevention, for want of a better word. And there are issues around the private sector. So private sector housing is going to be drawn upon very heavily for local authorities to fulfil their homelessness duty because local authorities don't have the properties anymore. But the private rented sector is unregulated. Private landlords, largely unregulated, it's regulated in name only. Private landlords are renting properties as a business venture. They don't necessarily have a set of social aims and objectives like local authorities have. So certainly some of our recommendations were around supporting the private rented sector to help to work with local authorities. And we recommended that local authorities would help them with things like repairs. They would also help them support people that might have vulnerabilities. So these things were taken into account in terms of policy change. And one of the things that we were very keen to emphasise was that the kind of welfare reform and universal credit, which is the new benefit system, actually creates problems and leads to homelessness. So, you know, we were very keen to point out that, you know, a vast majority of people that came that were homeless because of being evicted from the private rented sector, or because their benefits have become disrupted in some way. So yes, these things have been sort of taken into account. And we made some recommendations about how prison leavers actually experience the process once they're discharged from prison. So yeah, I was pleased that and some of them are still being worked through as well. Yeah.
It's just great to kind of to talk about the real life impact that research actually has, and what that has gone on to do is you know, changing the way that we like, you know, provide services. And I think, yeah, it's just important to kind of spot that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, Lauren. I think research has to have an impact. You know, I think it's really important if it's about people's lives that, you know, if you're engaging with people about things that they're experiencing, there has to be an outcome for them. And that outcome might not be directly related to that individual, but it has to be there then for other people that might be in that situation.
Just to kind of talk more broadly about the issue, I know there's a lot of speculation and spotlight on it at the minute nationally, just because of what the effects of COVID might be and the economic impact going forward. And do you think we'll see a sharp rise in families that are facing homelessness?
I think this is a real concern, because obviously, you know, homelessness doesn't take place within a vacuum. It takes place because of wider kind of structural trends in society. And we're in a situation where the benefit system is under the most enormous strain. More people are reliant on it. And I know, because I'm involved in, I sit on a board for a housing association in Manchester. People have lost their jobs because of COVID. Obviously, lack of employment and lack of income are factors which lead to people becoming homeless because they either can't pay the mortgage or pay the rent. The difficulty is in a situation where there's going to be a massive recession. Lots more people are going to be reliant on benefits. Arguably, the benefit system has got so many delays to it. You know, people could find themselves in real difficulties before they actually get funds that they're eligible for. So yeah, I am concerned about this, actually. I think there could very easily be a big increase in homelessness in the longer term. Yeah.
Do you plan to do any kind of research on that going forward?
I mentioned at the beginning that the overriding concern in the kind of COVID context was about those people that were faring terribly. Obviously, homeless people fit into that as well. One of the problems that local authorities have is that, you know, they have the responsibility to tackle homelessness. They have the kind of legal responsibility, but they have to rely on other providers to support them in that role, because they, you know, because of Right to Buy, they've sold a big proportion of their stock. So I think some work does need to be done with local authorities and private landlords in a local context. So yeah, that's definitely shaping our thinking for future bidding going forward.
I just wanted to take you back a little bit, Anya, just talking a bit more broadly about you then, and in your career now. We've got a really good grasp on the types of work you've been doing and what you're planning to do in the future. For anyone watching this, how did you get to this point? Did you study an undergraduate degree? Did you come through a postgraduate route? And did you kind of specialise in anything along the way?
Okay, that's. I always feel a bit funny answering this question because my trajectory, my route has not been. It's not like a traditional route, but I hope that sharing this can kind of, you know, you don't. It doesn't have to be. I suppose is what I want you to take from this. So yes, my first degree was social policy and sociology. I originally, I thought I was going to be a social worker. But in the final year of my undergraduate degree, I did a module on housing and became really interested in housing. So I ended up going on to do a master's, which was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council at the time. And then you kind of became this housing management trainee. So I worked in housing for about 5 years, and then I was kind of itching to get back into academia. So I took a lecturing job. But I was teaching mainly on sort of, I suppose what you describe me as a lecturer practitioner now, even though that term didn't exist at the time. And I was teaching on professional housing programs in Liverpool, first of all, and then I moved over to Salford. And it was, I didn't really, in the early 2000s, I thought, you know, if I'm going to stay in academia, I need to do a PhD. And I was doing some freelance work at the time, and I had a dilemma, you know, should I carry on with the freelance work, or shall I, you know, be a proper academic? And I decided to be a proper academic. So I did a PhD, but it took me ages because I did it part-time. So, but I was doing sort of contract research and teaching the whole time I was doing this PhD. So I got my PhD in 2010. And I did my PhD on British women's retirement to Spain. Because it was about community and about how people talk about community. And that kind of then, you know, when I talk to people, I've kind of had two academic careers, if you like, as a very teaching focused and contract jobbing researcher, to then somebody who was doing, you know, larger funded bids and being more research focused and publications. So I was, you know, I started off as a lecturer. I became a senior lecturer in 2009 in housing, but then a senior lecturer in social policy in 2012. And I would say the biggest changes really have been since 2012, when I've been very fortunate to have won some grants, published quite widely. I've written a lot in the last few years, so I've written sort of 3 books since 2015, and then, you know, I got my sort of chair. I got a personal chair in 2017, which was great. After applying for Reader in 2015 and not getting it, and then decided to, you know, throw caution to the wind. And then I've very recently, as you know, joined Manchester Met, which I'm delighted to be here. And that's kind of it. That's my potted history career. I didn't start off with a plan. This is the bit that I always feel a bit embarrassed about. Everything sort of evolved and had a very winding path. So, you know, but when I'm asked to kind of justify how it all fits together, I think it's really it's a focus on people and their lives in context, and that context can be places, networks, their identity, getting older, and that's the spin I put on it. But it's like a post hoc kind of justification rather than I had a plan. I'm always a bit envious of people that had a plan.
It's a common theme, the thing around people and just understanding people's experiences. And it's like the one that you mentioned earlier, one of your first studies about women moving to Spain.
Yes.
Based around basically just interviewing them and getting to know them and understanding their experiences. And
it was
deep level.
It was, yes, and it really gave me the opportunity, because taking you back a little bit further, when I applied to university, I didn't really know what social policy and sociology were, because I hadn't studied them, you know, before. And everybody thought I should do English. And part of me, you know, I still love, you know, literature, etc. But what that study enabled me to do was kind of draw upon literary theory. So I used narrative analysis, and I've developed this kind of form of narrative analysis, which centres very much on the way that people tell their stories, the kind of structure, you know, how stories are implotted, and how people position themselves as the central character and things like that. So, you know, one of the things I've been really pleased to work on is this melding of literary and social theory, which kind of underpins my thinking and the work that I do now.
You still remember what the findings were from your PhD? What some
Yeah.
of the insights were from that?
I really can remember. Well, it's interesting in the context that we're in now, where, you know, it's the Brexit sort of situation. Because one of the things that was coming across then, and I did the research, the fieldwork, probably, it was 20 years ago now, and people were talking very, very strongly about why they'd moved to Spain, because they felt that there were too many foreigners in England. Of course, I did the interviews in Spain, and people's understanding and conceptions of themselves weren't necessarily weren't as foreign, or, you know, they didn't see themselves as foreign even while they were in Spain. And I think, you know, I still think about this quite a lot, because I think there are a lot of parallels between, you know, I don't want to be sort of overly contentious, but you know, the kind of reasons why people wanted to leave the EU, but perhaps didn't really consider what that would mean for individuals as European citizens. You know, it's kind of interesting that it's kind of a privileged position to be in, where ethnicities seem to be something that other people have, and, you know, not necessarily yourself type of thing. So yeah, that was quite an important finding, about how people see themselves. I think what the central premise of the work was about community. So at the time, the Labour government at the time was very keen on community. You might not remember, but community cohesion, and, you know, it was very much on the sort of political and policy agendas. And what was really interesting, I think, was that people's ideas about what community is often differ than this kind of meta-narrative of what politicians say it is. You know, they sort of present that in a way that it embodies these particular kind of activities and contexts. But actually, people kind of make their own communities, and they define themselves, you know, as they choose, rather than as might be kind of denoted by policymakers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like, you know, the kind of the clearly defined community groups that get together and have these kind of, it's not necessarily as formulaic as that, and as kind of
and it's more fluid. You know, I think that's the other thing that, you know, I think I started off by saying before, the idea of community still fascinates me, because what we talk about and what community means to us, we're not just talking about community, we're actually talking about the way we experience the world in terms of the physical context that we find ourselves in, those people that we think are like us for whatever reason, and how we kind of interact with them. And I think that is probably at the root of much social science research, to be honest.
Yeah, it's amazing how those parallels between your PhD have actually been shown in the decisions that the UK have made in the last few years.
It'd be a really interesting read, I think, and like in retrospect now.
Well, I was very fortunate to be able to publish a research monograph based on my PhD, and because that was published a few years later, I was able to kind of analyse it in a different way, if that makes sense. So I was able to take account of, you know, kind of wider things that had happened since 2010, basically. So I've got the benefit of being able to look back over the last 15 years kind of temporally, but also take into account the kind of changing political environment. You know, we were moving towards Brexit by then, and those tensions were becoming a lot more apparent. And, you know, I was able to kind of take those into account as well.
Just coming back to your career then, it seems like actually you used your gut instinct quite a lot to decide what you wanted to do throughout your career without having that plan, but still thinking this is what my gut's telling me to do.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's very well observed. I think that's how I am really. Yes, I think pretty much all the decisions I make are based on kind of intuition, a sense of just knowing that this is right or this is not right. You know, I remember what I was telling you about before about, you know, should I do the freelance work or should I become an academic? And I started off by making a list of the positives for each one. But even when I'd got the list, you know, actually the list for doing the freelance work was longer, you know, because I was doing sort of training and consultancy. But actually that process made me realise that that's not what I wanted to do, and kind of following my gut or my heart, whichever way you want to put it, won out in the end. Yeah.
Just thinking about those experiences, then there'll be quite a few people watching this, I think, that are kind of in that decision-making process of what the next step could be. What advice would you give to people that are maybe looking at going into, that might have done the undergraduate degree and they're thinking of going into further study?
Yeah, I think base it on, I always say this to people who are thinking about doing a PhD or embarking on a career path. Can you see yourself doing it in 3-5 years time? And if you can't, then don't do it. And I'm not saying that people should stay in the same job for 5 years, but how does the idea of doing it make you feel fulfilled and happy? And I know that might sound very, very basic, but I think that's, you know, I think that's probably the most important.
You recently mentioned that you've only just kind of joined Manchester Met.
Yes.
What do you see your involvement being with students, with the student population?
Well, I'm looking forward to teaching. I've been meeting with the unit leads this week, so I'm going to be doing some contributions on 2 units. The contributions, I think, will be mainly based on me bringing the kind of research that I've done to them, to kind of give some contextual understanding of some of the theoretical and conceptual and policy issues that they will be exploring in terms of, you know, marginalisation, community, ageing, etc. So I'm going to be able to bring in some very recent research projects, which will show, I think, the kind of lived experience side of things. So we won't just be talking about policy implementation from a policy making perspective. We'll be looking at actually, how do these policies play out in people's lives? How do they experience them? And what are the kind of challenges for policy implementation at the grassroots level? So I'm really excited about that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds great. You've got me hooked on it as well.
You're very welcome to join us.
What level of study will you be supporting with them with the teaching? Okay,
so I think I want to support it from, you know, level 4 to level 8, you know, so from the very new undergraduates who are just starting with us in their first year, right through the programme. I know I'm going to be contributing each year, also on the masters, because we have a masters programme as well. So I'll be looking at the integrated health and social care programmes, and I'm very willing and keen to contribute to the social work programme, because that's also in our department. And obviously we're recruiting PhD students at the moment as well, so the whole thing. Yeah.
Fantastic. So thanks, Anya, so much for joining us today. It's been lovely speaking to you.
Well, likewise. Thank you.